When we talk about the environment a baby grows up in, most people immediately think about nutrition, sleep schedules, vaccines, and physical safety. And all of those things absolutely matter. But there is something else, something far less visible, that shapes a baby's developing brain in ways that can last for decades, and that is the emotional atmosphere of the home. Specifically, the way parents talk to each other, argue with each other, and manage conflict in each other's presence. A baby doesn't need to understand words to be affected by the energy in the room. What seems like background noise to an adult is, for an infant, one of the most powerful forces acting on their neurological development. Let's begin with something fundamental. A baby is not a blank slate who simply waits to become a person. From the moment of birth, and in fact, from before birth, a baby is already processing the emotional world around them. Their brain is undergoing its most explosive period of development in the first 3 years of life. More than 1 million new neural connections form every single second in those early months, and the architecture of those connections is not random. It is shaped profoundly by experience. The brain literally wires itself according to what it encounters. If it encounters warmth, predictability, and calm, it develops certain pathways. If it encounters tension, unpredictability, and fear, it develops others. Now, parental conflict comes in many forms, and it's important to be nuanced here from the beginning. There is a big difference between two parents who occasionally disagree, work through it respectfully, and move on, and two parents who engage in frequent, intense, or unresolved conflict involving raised voices, contempt, threatening body language, or prolonged hostility. Research consistently shows that it is that second category, what researchers call destructive conflict, that poses real risks to infant and child development. So let's talk about what actually happens in a baby's body and brain when they are exposed to that kind of environment. When a baby hears angry voices, and they can detect anger in tone of voice as early as 6 months old, possibly earlier, a cascade of biological events is triggered. The amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, activates. This sends signals to the hypothalamus, which then activates the body's stress response system, known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This results in the release of cortisol, which is the body's primary stress hormone. Now, a small, well-timed stress response is actually healthy. It helps us respond to challenges and then return to baseline. But when a baby's stress response is triggered repeatedly, intensely, and without resolution or comfort, something very different happens. The system becomes sensitized. The baby's brain begins to expect danger. It begins to operate in a state of heightened alert. And because the brain is so plastic, so moldable at this stage of development, that heightened alert state doesn't just come and go. It becomes the brain's default setting. Neuroscientists call this a sensitized stress response system. The threshold for perceiving threat drops. Small things begin to trigger big reactions. And this doesn't go away when the conflict does. The wiring has been laid. Dr. Megan Gunner, who has done some of the most important research on early stress and cortisol in infants, has shown that babies who are frequently exposed to conflict and stress, especially in the absence of a consistently comforting caregiver, show measurably higher baseline cortisol levels. That means they are carrying more stress in their bodies chronically, even when nothing upsetting is happening in that particular moment. Their nervous system is essentially running at a higher idle, and that costs something. It costs energy that could go toward learning, toward play, toward connection. And over time, elevated cortisol can actually damage the hippocampus, the brain region critical for memory, learning, and emotional regulation. Let's talk about emotional regulation specifically, because this is where the long-term consequences of parental conflict become especially visible. Babies are born with no ability to regulate their own emotions. Zero. They are completely dependent on their caregivers to help them do this, a process called co-regulation. When a baby is upset, they cry, and a caregiver responds by picking them up, soothing them, talking to them in a calm voice, making eye contact. Over time, thousands and thousands of these small interactions literally build the neural circuitry in the baby's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for managing emotions, making decisions, and calming the amygdala when it fires off in response to stress. But here's the critical thing. When parents are locked in chronic conflict, their ability to serve as that calming, regulating presence for their baby is fundamentally compromised. A parent who is themselves dysregulated, flooded with anger, anxiety, or grief, cannot reliably co-regulate their infant. The very mechanism through which the baby learns to self-regulate later in life is disrupted. This is not a moral judgment about parents who are struggling in their relationships. It is simply a biological reality. A stressed caregiver produces a stressed infant, and a stressed infant who doesn't receive sufficient co-regulation develops a stress response system that remains poorly calibrated well into childhood, adolescence, and beyond. There is also something researchers call the spillover effect. When parents have a serious argument, the emotional residue of that argument doesn't evaporate the moment the argument ends. It lingers. It affects how they interact with their baby in the hours that follow. Studies have shown that after a conflictual episode between partners, parents tend to be less warm, less responsive, more irritable, and more withdrawn with their infants, even when they are genuinely trying not to be. The baby picks up on all of it. Babies are exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of their caregivers. They are watching faces, reading body language, sensing tension in the way they are held, and they respond to what they sense, not what adults intend. Mark Cummings and Patrick Davies, two of the leading researchers in this area, have developed what they call the emotional security theory to explain how children respond to interparental conflict. The central idea is that a child's primary goal, even in infancy, is to feel emotionally secure within the family. When that security is threatened by parental conflict, the child's brain and body mobilize to protect against that threat. In the short term, this looks like distress, crying, clinging, hypervigilance. In the longer term, it can result in persistent anxiety, difficulty with emotional regulation, problems with trust and attachment, and even behavioral problems that emerge as the child grows older and enters social settings like daycare or school. The type of conflict matters enormously. Research shows that children and babies, even at very young ages, respond differently depending on the nature of what they are witnessing. Physical aggression is the most harmful, producing the strongest and most sustained stress responses. But verbal aggression, including contempt, screaming, and prolonged hostile arguing, is also deeply damaging. What is sometimes surprising to parents is that even nonverbal conflict, cold silences, slamming doors, tense physical posturing, registers clearly with infants and toddlers. Children are not fooled by parents who argue quietly. They perceive the emotional undertow even when no words are exchanged. On the other end of the spectrum, research has found that the resolution of conflict actually matters, and in a genuinely hopeful way. When children witness conflict that is followed by resolution, by parents working through the disagreement, reaching a compromise, repairing the rupture, their stress response, which has been activated by the conflict, actually returns to baseline more quickly than it would have otherwise. The witnessing of effective conflict resolution teaches children that conflict is manageable, that relationships can withstand tension, that ruptures can be repaired. This becomes a deeply important piece of emotional learning. Children who grow up watching their parents fight, but also watching them make up, apologize, and reconnect, develop significantly better emotional resilience than children who only ever witness the fight without the resolution. This is why researchers draw such a strong distinction between what they call constructive and destructive conflict. Constructive conflict, where parents disagree but stay regulated, listen to each other, avoid contempt, and work toward resolution, is not just harmless to children. It can actually be beneficial. It models problem solving. It demonstrates that two people can have different views and still respect each other. It shows that emotions can be managed and expressed without becoming destructive. Destructive conflict, by contrast, where conflict is frequent, intense, hostile, involves contempt or stonewalling, and remains unresolved, is the kind that does cumulative damage to the developing nervous system of a young child. Now let's talk about attachment, because this is inseparable from everything we've been discussing. John Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth established the foundational science of attachment theory, which tells us that babies are biologically wired to form deep bonds with their primary caregivers, and that the quality of those bonds has profound implications for their emotional and social development throughout life. The attachment relationship is essentially the baby's emotional home base. When they feel secure in that relationship, they can explore, take risks, and eventually develop into emotionally healthy individuals. When that relationship is disrupted or unreliable, the effects ripple outward. Parental conflict disrupts attachment in a very specific and painful way. It puts the baby in an impossible position. The people who are the source of the baby's comfort and safety are simultaneously the source of the threat. The baby cannot escape by fleeing toward their attachment figure, because their attachment figures are the ones causing the alarm. This is sometimes described as fear without solution, the simultaneous activation of the fear system and the attachment system with no resolution available. When this happens repeatedly, it contributes to what researchers call disorganized attachment, the most problematic attachment style associated with significant emotional and behavioral difficulties later in life. It is also worth talking about the prenatal period, because the story begins even before birth. There is now strong evidence that elevated maternal stress during pregnancy, including stress arising from relationship conflict, affects the developing fetus. Stress hormones cross the placental barrier. The fetal brain is already developing its stress response architecture, and it is already being calibrated by the hormonal environment of the womb. Studies have found associations between high prenatal maternal stress and altered cortisol reactivity in infants, differences in temperament, and heightened vulnerability to anxiety. This doesn't mean that any stress during pregnancy is catastrophic, but it does mean that chronic, unmanaged relationship conflict during pregnancy is not neurologically neutral for the baby. Let's also consider what all of this means for the immune system, because the connection between stress and immune function is deep and well established. Chronic early life stress has been linked to dysregulation of the immune system, including heightened inflammatory responses. This matters because inflammation is now understood to be a factor in a wide range of physical and mental health conditions. Research under the framework of adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs research, famously initiated by Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda, has shown that exposure to household conflict and related stressors in early childhood is associated with significantly elevated risk of physical illness, mental illness, and shortened lifespan in adulthood. The body keeps score, as Bessel van der Kolk put it so memorably, and it begins keeping score from the very earliest days of life. One thing that is critically important to say at this point is that none of this is a message of despair. Brain plasticity, the same quality that makes the developing brain so vulnerable to early adversity, also makes it responsive to intervention and healing. Warm, consistent, attuned caregiving, even if it comes after a period of difficulty, can do a remarkable amount to buffer and even partially reverse the effects of early stress. This is why interventions that support parents in their relationship with each other and their relationship with their baby can be genuinely transformative. Programs that help couples manage conflict more constructively, that teach parents to notice and respond to their baby's emotional cues, and that build parental reflective capacity, the ability to hold the baby's inner experience in mind, have all shown meaningful positive effects on infant development and on the parent-child relationship. Reflective functioning, or mentalization, deserves a particular mention here because it is one of the most powerful protective factors we know of. When a parent can think about what might be happening inside their baby's mind, can wonder, why is she so unsettled? Is she picking up on my stress? What does she need from me right now? That reflective capacity fundamentally changes the quality of the caregiving. It shifts the parent from a reactive mode into a thoughtful mode. And babies whose caregivers are high in reflective functioning tend to develop more secure attachment, even in the presence of other stressors. It is not perfection that babies need. It is attunement. It is the experience of being seen and understood. So what does all of this mean practically? It means that one of the most important things parents can do for their baby's brain and emotional health is to take their own relationships seriously as a developmental environment, to get support for their relationship if they need it, to learn to argue differently, not to avoid all conflict, but to engage in it in ways that are less hostile, more regulated, and more likely to reach genuine resolution. It means that staying together for the kids in a context of ongoing destructive conflict does not protect children. It means that fathers matter as much as mothers in this equation. Studies show that paternal involvement and the quality of the co-parenting relationship are independently significant for infant outcomes, and it means that the idea of babies as resilient little creatures who just bounce back from whatever happens around them is not supported by the science. They are deeply, biologically sensitive to the emotional atmosphere in which they develop. It is also worth naming something about cultural and economic context, because no honest conversation about parental conflict can ignore the fact that conflict is often amplified by stress, and that stress is unevenly distributed. Families living in poverty, families navigating housing insecurity, families dealing with racism, families with parents who are working multiple jobs and exhausted all the time. These families face structural pressures that elevate conflict risks significantly. The science of early brain development does not exist in a vacuum. It sits within a social context, and the implications of that science must include a commitment to reducing the structural stressors that make it so much harder for parents to be the regulated, warm, emotionally available caregivers their babies need them to be. We are at a moment in developmental science where we understand more than we ever have about what actually happens inside a baby's brain when they are exposed to parental conflict. The amygdala fires, cortisol floods the body, stress response systems are sensitized, attachment security is disrupted. The architecture of the developing brain is shaped in ways that have long-lasting consequences for emotional regulation, mental health, physical health, and the capacity to form healthy relationships in adulthood. And we also understand more than ever about what protects babies, what buffers those effects, and what helps the brain develop the resilience and flexibility it needs to thrive. It is consistent, warm, attuned caregiving. It is parents who take their own well-being and their relationship with each other seriously. It is the willingness to seek help when conflict becomes chronic or harmful, and it is the profound recognition, which the science demands we hold, that the emotional life of a baby is not background noise. It is the very center of their world, and the foundation upon which everything else will be built.